Benson, who's just returned from a 2-month tour of China doing sort of author education and outreach. And she's been across China in a sort of Marco Polo-esque route from the west of China through to the east in Shanghai. And Philippa has a lot of experience. Prior to working for Charlesworth, Philippa used to teach and live and work in China. She taught technical writing. Philippa's also worked with a number of different publishers and now works with Charlesworth heading up our education division based here but also in China. We've really as a company seen the growing sort of need for authors to be educated, to develop and so Philippa's going to give us a rundown of her last 2.5 months overseas.
I literally just came back from China a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to change the mode of presentation here from a little bit of hard data to a little bit more of a travelogue. But I hope it's interesting and informative. Just to give you a bit of background, I want to start with some basics. Some of you in the audience may have seen this dog and pony before, but I think it's important because I will refer back to it. But just to start, when we're talking about authors and researchers and their challenges and the current situation they find themselves in, I want to start with a tiny primer on Chinese language. And for those of you who are native speakers and learners of Chinese here, please step in and correct me if I'm incorrect. But this does begin with how Chinese learn language. So to begin, just to differentiate mainland China from Taiwan, in mainland China now there are simplified characters. When the current government came in, they wanted to really spread literacy and took very complicated characters and simplified them to make them easier to learn. So in 1956, you went from traditional characters to simplified characters. Now, remember that there are 5 separate spoken Chinese languages, mutually unintelligible to each other. However, the spoken language is the same. The written language is the same. So you can give someone a piece of paper that says, jump up and down and pat yourself on the head in writing, and someone will do that who reads Chinese. But if you ask them to say it out loud, and they're from different areas of the country, they will speak words that sound very, very different. And there are very regional differences, distinct, and you can see the numbers here. Also remember, when a child is learning Chinese, they have to learn, we learn 26 characters. To be literate in China, you have to learn between 2,000 and 3,000 characters, separate characters. And you have to learn how to write them, and to write them correctly, you have to write them in a very specific order to have them be framed and actually legible as that character. So that is what small children spend their time doing, actually sitting and copying these characters to be symmetrical and to write strokes in the correct order. In addition, many words have a very similar look but completely different sounds and meanings. This is why, after the 3rd year of my study of Chinese, I gave up reading and writing. I just gave up. Because if I went away from reading a 2nd grade primer for a week, I would forget that one meant hao and that one meant nai. I would just forget. I had too many other things going on, and I didn't have the baseline of reading. So this is where the copying and memorization comes in to really the base learning modality of Chinese in becoming literate. So to remember, exact copying is a primary pedagogical method. You have to learn how to copy exactly to learn how to basically write. Loose copying, as children get into middle school and high school, getting a sentence or a text that sounds good and that looks good is something that's valued and thought to be good. Certainly copying famous writers is something that is a often used pedagogical method. And then as you get into high school and college, particularly in learning how to read and write English, looking at models is a very common method. So reading the Walt Whitmans and other classics is something, and then taking those texts and saying, those are beautiful, let's use those as models. Now, that is the idea that copying isn't something that should be done is definitively taking root in China, particularly in the university and graduate levels. But it is based on a primary learning methodology that's fundamental to learners of Chinese language. And Jan, if you disagree with me on this in any variation, please pipe in. Pardon?
I'm really
Good. Okay, so I just want to lay that down as something to have as context. Now, as Adrian said, I first went to China in 1986. I taught there for 2 years. I went back. I worked with non-native speakers of English, studying their reading and writing processes on a cognitive level for my PhD dissertation. And then I've worked with non-native speakers of English, primarily ideographic language readers and writers since then. So from that, I have come out with these basic ideas, which I believe are true. In China, most adults studying English are taught by non-native speakers of English, not by native speakers. Now, there are an increasing number of businesses that are teaching business English, and there's even Disney English now throughout the big cities. But increasingly, there's still a lot of information given about proper English speaking, writing, given by non-native speakers. Chinese learning English in China develop much, much, much better reading than writing or speaking skills. So getting texts in English and understanding them, being able to process them and use the information is for university students and beyond is not as big as a challenge as it is certainly in the reverse order for us. University students learn from government-created curricula. To graduate from an undergraduate institution, there are band requirements or levels that a student has to pass. And those are very, very strictly controlled. And someone was asking about the higher education presses. It is the higher education presses that put out these English language materials that have to go across the country to obviously millions and millions of people. Writing is evaluated at the university and even at the graduate level initially on correctness of grammar and syntax. And there's very little taught about cultural context or professional contexts. Now, at graduate levels, for scientists in the United States, that's really true as well, and in the West. But that is something to bear in mind. And also, students, graduate students, postdocs, researchers still do have some limits on their access to the internet. So these are things to bear in mind about the starting levels of researchers in China. So this is how I got my view at this point. I was in Shanghai in 1989, and just to bear in mind, we haven't really seen too much of a map, but if you were to put a sort of crosshair grid over this map of China, most of the institutions of higher education are to the east, and you can see that some of the autonomous regions where some of the most rapid development are also on that eastern coast. The darker regions, just to bear in mind, they're called municipalities, but they're also independent economic and sometimes sort of political or legal zones. So the rules can differ in these places. In this last trip that I went to, this central dark region that I saw, I found that that municipality has started some rules that allow foreign, not-for-profit organizations to register themselves in a much easier fashion than elsewhere. So if you wanted to be the Association of Law, it would be easier to register yourself there than somewhere else. It's sort of like thinking about registering your company in Delaware. You know, it's that kind of equivalent. It's so something to bear in mind. So these regional differences and this idea of partnerships is really critical, because place to place things differ, and they differ in small ways and they can differ in very profound ways as well. So 1986 to now, things have changed, and what I found in the past 5 years, I've gone to China for between 2 weeks and 2 months every year for the past 5 years, and traveled around the country on the ground, teaching students in universities, meeting publishers. So this is not the big data picture. This is the face-to-face sitting and talking and having lunch and hearing questions. So to remind you, we all know that the job market here is tough. But the job market in China is tougher. I cannot emphasize the stress that people feel, people who have advanced degrees. They're ambitious, they're educated, and they're trying to climb up this mass. For those of you that work in biomedicine and the health sciences, I also want to underscore that the job of being a doctor in an urban hospital, which are the main population centers, that job is insane. This is something that came across in the last 2 years that I've been there, and particularly this last trip. If you want to progress as a doctor, you must get a PhD after you get your MD. And in order to get a PhD, you must publish. To get that degree in your hand, you must publish between 1 and 3 articles in high-impact SCI journals. You don't get the degree in your hand without those publications, no exceptions. So that pressure, plus these are 2 typical scenes outside medical hospitals. The patient load is between 50 and 100 patients per day. And I went to medical hospitals, I went to lectured in a lot of different places and kept asking, is this true? 50 patients a day? They were like, yep. In fact, in some cities, they've started putting police into hospitals to protect doctors because patients become so distressed at the lack of attention their brother, father, sister, husband, wife have gotten that they can't control themselves and they attack the doctors. And you can see this on YouTube. You can see doctors being attacked. So I just want to stress there is extraordinary pressure on researchers. So 2007 to now, many different cities, key universities, Chinese Academy of Sciences, which has a main branch and then many variations, medical associations, the science press, urban hospitals, second and key, which are those top-tier universities. I went with another speaker, John Inglis here, who has great stories to tell you about Cold Spring Harbor, professional associations of publishers, Jan's associations. So this is where some of this came from. So in the last 2 months, boink, 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 that's my Marco Polo adventures. And this is where my strange voice comes from. So, to look at this, what I have been doing is going with different associations and slicing the pie. So, looking at and listening to the needs of authors and hearing responses from publishers. So last year I went with the Operation Geophysics and the Geological Society of America with a panel of their editors and sat and talked to geophysicists and got a really good sense of what their specific challenges and questions were in that domain. These are just other pictures that show typical audience density. So as David was saying, there are real efforts to educate. I'm very popular because people want to hear this kind of information, particularly at these top institutions. They're very eager to understand what the parameters are and to figure out how to address them. From individuals to departments in hospitals to universities. This idea of coming down hard on ethics breaches I heard resoundly in this last trip. That is being put into place. Again, these are one of these increasing impact English language journals that are produced in hospitals. The picture on the bottom is at Cold Spring Harbor. So, what are the authors really interested? What are authors and researchers really interested in finding out? And this, I think, is a relatively comprehensive list. And so assessing the newness of their science, one of the things that came across in this most recent trip is that the researchers at the top tiers are really starting to understand that they're getting rejected not because their English is poor. And that is something even 5 years ago that researchers would say, well, I'm being rejected because my English is poor. Now they're understanding that good English is a fundamental starting place, but that they have to contextualize their work in the global market of new information. So they're starting to understand that that part of their work is to find out where their piece of the puzzle fits. Another major point is that they're starting to realize that if they just go for high-impact journals all the time, their high-impact journals have high rejection rates. So they need to spend more time selecting the right journal, understanding what the scope of various journals are, so that they need to study those scopes. Writing the key sections, as those of you have worked on the editorial side, your editors get a manuscript in, read a title, and sometimes even from the title, boom, it goes into the reject without review pile, and it might be the abstract or the introduction that helps the editor understand the match between the journal and the research. And the researchers are starting to realize that when they're concentrating on writing, those are the sections where they win or lose getting into the pile that goes to peer review. Using citations and understanding impact factors. There are many discussions that come up about this. The researchers that I've interacted with do not want to let go of the impact factor because their boss wants them to publish in a high impact factor journal. Their spouse wants them to publish in a high impact journal. Their wallet wants them to do it. You can get a lot of money for having success in getting into a high impact journal. But there are high rejection rates. I talked to many authors who kept on submitting to high-impact journals, and they said, well, this is the 7th time I've been rejected. And, I would say, well, maybe you should think about changing your strategy a little bit. So there were more discussions. Writing, authorship, the role of cover letters, figures and tables, how to submit a manuscript. One of the things I did recently on this last trip, I have just worked with PLOS One, you are probably familiar with that journal, in rewriting their instructions for authors. And they posted them, and then I went and did user tests. Actually had Chinese authors sit down and submit manuscripts and do think aloud protocols. And really realized that there are a lot of even these basics about the requirements that are dug down deep into how an article needs to be formulated in different domains that are not well understood. Now, that being said, they're not well understood by a lot of novice authors in the West as well, but that's neither here nor there. Who does what in peer review? Understanding decision letters is something that the authors will get a decision letter, see you're rejected, and boom, that's it. They don't read it. They don't mine it for the useful information. And they're starting to learn that the rejection letters are sources of information. Where to get help with writing, ethical issues and future trends, particularly about technology and costs. So, yes, the lessons learned about authors now, they still want to publish in high-impact journals. They want to better understand. They're eager, they're looking for, they're hungry for more information about how to succeed in publishing. How do I get into this journal? And they're looking for that information. They again, in order to get a PhD, you have to publish. And in order to get to advance as a medical doctor, you have to get a PhD. So these are some of the fundamental goals that are still pressing all the researchers who are submitting to the journals that you're publishing. Now, what can editors and publishers do? Provide information on free research resources related to publications. In some places that I went these last 2 months, people knew Web of Science. They knew PubMed Central. They knew not all, but a solid variety of places they could go to evaluate where their piece of the puzzle fit in. There were other places, major urban medical hospitals with 200 doctors trying to get their PhDs, and they didn't know about PubMed Central. Just didn't know about it. So to move ahead and help the researchers there find places where they can contextualize the work that they're doing in the broadest and most affordable scope possible is something that would be valued. Understanding submissions and rejections when your journals, what you're publishing, understanding what's coming in and what's getting rejected and why it's getting rejected. The work that I've done for publishers with their instructions to authors and getting the data to drive that, to drive the revisions, was extremely informative. So logging when you get submissions, where they're coming from, what kind of place they're coming from, and what the topics are, and of those, what's getting rejected and why. Collecting that data and using it to build a strategy to help the people who are submitting better understand what their parameters for success should be. To review and improve statements on journal audiences and goals, so people submitting can understand what a journal does and does not want to publish, what the scope is, something as simple as that. Providing on websites these basic publishing 101s, plagiarism, review, introductions. Once you've collected data about why submissions are being rejected, then flip that over and provide instruction that's particular to your materials and your journals. Prepare and use a wider variety of standard response letters that have as much information as you can provide to authors about why their papers are being rejected and making concrete suggestions about what they can do. And if you have, those categorized to say, for example, you have submitted on topic X, that is outside of our domain. Perhaps you should look at journals X, A, B, and C, something of that sort. So it doesn't take your staffs a long time. They have, a dozen different rejection letters that are actually informative and very clearly written for non-native speakers of English to understand and use and respond to that information. Provide examples. Now, again, thinking about this idea of plagiarism, not going overboard, but having some good examples and explaining why they're good to use as models, not for copying, but using as models can be really useful. Write editorials that talk about some of these problems, that talk about your specific publications and the challenges you're having and what you're doing to address them and where people can go to get other kinds of information. And provide information that describes your review process and states the value of non-acceptance. Again, that says this doesn't mean you should take the same paper and submit it elsewhere. Resubmit it here once you've polished it a bit, but rather what specific things they can do to improve the document. And also provide vetted resources for training and language polishing service. If language is the problem, do send them off to a list. One of the things with instructions to authors, many journal sites provide big long lists of services, and many authors don't know they're there. And also there's online training that people are having, video clips, editors giving little talks about their attitudes towards cover letters or the role of abstracts, providing that information that helps the authors start to feel that the journal is providing a service to them, even if they're not getting accepted there. So that's sort of my travelogue in a nutshell. There are a couple of things that I do want to mention that I think will have some impact over the next several years that is outside the domain of STM publishing, and this is in particular in the area of technical communication. During my sojourns, part of the work I did was for the Society for Technical Communication. We have been talking about pharma, about industry development, about technology and manufacturing. One of the things that is not in place right now in China are technical documentation standards. There are very strict standards in the United States and Europe and Japan and Korea. Those standards are not in place and not enforced in China right now. It's very loosey-goosey. Next year, or actually at the end of this year, there will be the first international meeting of setting standards for technical documentation. So if you are manufacturing a drug or a widget and there has to be a document that legally details the specifics of that, the rules for those are going to be created in China in the next 3 years, let's say. But they're just starting off on that. That's something that is going to impact how researchers work, how they're funded, and the technologies that they use that are homebound, born, and bred. So that's a different topic, but I did want to underscore that that's something that's on the horizon. Thanks.
Yep.